Thank you very much, Jessica. It's a real pleasure to be here today with a stellar lineup here for the palliative care panel. So my name is Emily Rigby. I'm very proud to be representing both the AIMC and Canatrek today. So I would like to just ask all of the panelists actually to introduce themselves. We've got a variety of different doctors today. So I might start with Dr. Matua Jansen, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi there, thank you, Emily, and thank you to the AIMC for having me. My name is Dr. Matua Jansen. I'm a medical cannabis doctor. I'm also a Kiwi, that's where that accent comes from. My background is I am an Indigenous Māori from New Zealand, did my medical school in Auckland before moving across to Australia. I became an Australian beginning of last year, and my background was I was a medical officer in oncology for nearly a decade down in St George private hospital there in Sydney before transitioning across to medical cannabis. I also wear two hats. I've got the hat of a clinician and the hat of a manager. Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm grateful to be on this excellent panel of specialists.
Thanks, Matua. Dr. Teresa Towpik, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation. It is my great pleasure to speak here today. So yes, I am the founder and medical director of Medihuana, and this organization was founded in October 2016 in order to provide structured, science-based, ICGP accredited education for doctors. And I'm very proud to say that since 2nd of May, we've delivered 6 full-day workshops accredited by college, 40 points. And the workshops are designed to just equip doctors with practical skills to confidently and safely prescribe medicinal cannabis in their own practice. And we have received very positive feedback. So now I've been prescribing medicinal cannabis, but now my main focus is to deliver this education.
Excellent, thank you, Teresa. Dr. Joel Wren, would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you. So my name is Dr. Joel Wren. I'm a GP registrar living and working in South Australia currently. I studied in Queensland at UQ, but I've moved for my wife's practice as well. I have been in the medicinal cannabis sphere for around about 12 months now. And I find it's really, really interesting because it is one of the few areas of medicine that has been patient-driven rather than the other way around. And I'm really, really passionate about palliative care specifically, just because I find that it's done quite poorly overall. And I'm lucky enough to be part of the GP palliative shared care program that we have here in South Australia as well.
Great, thanks, Joel. And Dr. Gull Herzberg, if you can unmute yourself and introduce.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Gull, Dr. Gull Herzberg. I live and work on the mid-north coast of New South Wales, and remotely, as many of us do. And I'm an integrative GP, so officially a GP. I do lots of things. I've been prescribing medical cannabis for about, 3 years now. Yeah, it's a very rewarding area of medicine. I use it in all the areas of work that I do. I see a lot of patients. I actually get referrals for a lot of patients for a range of reasons, including obviously pain. And I'm also using medicinal cannabis. I work in aged care as well, and I've just started to sneak that into some of my residential aged care patients as well. And yeah, it's great to be part of this panel and part of the process of getting such a useful clinical tool into the mainstream medical culture.
Excellent, thank you all. We've definitely got a fantastic panel today. So again, if anyone has any questions while we're discussing, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A section. But probably just to start off, and I'm not sure who would like to first answer this question. But I'm just, looking at when is it actually appropriate to consider cannabis for a patient who needs palliative care, and for which symptoms is it most often prescribed for in this situation?
I'd like to comment on that. So I think it's very appropriate to prescribe medicinal cannabis for any palliative care patient. I'm a little bit sad that cannabis is still a second-line treatment in Australia, but it's unapproved because based on my observation and clinical experience, I can say it's much safer than anything else that we are using, much better tolerated, and also clinical responses are much better as well. So, but currently we can only prescribe medicinal cannabis to patients who failed the traditional treatment. But I really feel that it should be much more available than that. And the patients present with many symptoms. Pain would be probably the most common, and pain makes their life unbearable. Plus, obviously, it's associated with other mental problems, anxiety, depression, and some other significant issues as well. So I'd like to see cannabis really available as a first-line treatment, or it should be the choice of clinician and a patient, and not necessarily politicians.
And just to add to that, I think that pain is certainly the most common reason that we'd at least consider something like this, but it can be absolutely fantastic for sleep as well, and insomnia, so that when patients are sleeping better, their mood tends to improve, their pain tends to improve. It's a really wonderful multimodal treatment as well. And as Dr. Towpik mentioned, it is just such a shame that we're not able to access it as that first-line treatment. We have to try something else, wait for it to fail, and then make that switch.
I also want to add to that, this euphoric effects of THC, this is actually the area that this is quite desirable. It's quite okay when you are in this situation to feel a bit of, that you can sleep, that's very important, but euphoric, more peaceful, accepting, surrendering. And we hear from families of the patient who passed away, and I hear this comment quite a lot. He or she passed away peacefully holding our hands, and this is priceless.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow, it sounds really incredible just, how maybe the cannabis is prescribed for a certain, to treat a certain symptom, but it does really seem to improve quality of life across the board. Are there any patients whom cannabis should not be considered?
I don't think, look, obviously there are some adverse effects, like, pregnant lactating women, probably not the consideration here. However, you never know. And, some psychotic episodes, but psychosis in the past, this is just a very relative contraindication. We can still manage this quite effectively. So I really don't believe that, in my personal opinion, I could be wrong, I don't see any contraindication in this situation. We just want to deliver the good quality of life, good symptom control, and assist these patients in experiencing dignity of their life and death.
In this patient population, I suppose one of the considerations would be your unstable cardiovascular disease patients, and especially if they're on GTN sprays, or if they're actually on isosorbide mononitrate, things like that. These are all relative contraindications, and they're more or less just reasons to start at a lower dose and actually titrate more slowly than what you'd typically do for other patients. But I've never found a hard and fast rule not to at least consider something like cannabis.
Yeah, I agree. And adverse effects can be managed quite effectively in a proper clinical practice. And we always, practice that start low, go slow, because like Tamara mentioned, we want to have the most minimal and effective dose and no adverse effects.
I agree with the panel there. When we say is it appropriate to consider, I'd have to favour what Dr. Teresa said, which is this should be a consideration for all patients. If they've reached the status of being defined as palliative care and we've moved away from active clinical or curative treatment, then we should be proposing this. Many of the patients that I consult with indeed have come to me with an understanding of overall what the cannabinoids can do, phytocannabinoids can do to their system. The patients that I see are quite well educated. To tell a small story about my background, one day when I was at St George Private writing chemotherapy for a patient, they were coming in for their day surgery for their chemotherapy for metastatic breast cancer. And they got to the stage now where just the thought of going into the hospital was enough to induce chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. Just the thought of it. It was a very similar story to Dan Haslam and his fight with metastatic colorectal cancer. Just the thought of going into hospital was so challenging for patients. And when they get down to it, this patient sat me down and said, I'm not going to be doing chemotherapy anymore. I find that it's causing so many side effects to me, which goes back to what a fellow panelist said, that when other medications have failed or cause side effects, that you've got a good consideration for medical cannabis. But also when the patient has done their own research and is willing to reach down into their bag and put up studies and say, why did you not know about this? Where's the duty for the doctor to ensure that they are considering both ARTT listed medication and non-ARTT or unapproved medicines. So I think it's twofold, the education of the doctor and also the wishes or intentions of the patients. But I will premise that by saying that an important thing for all clinicians is that we are realistic with the goals of treatment. Personally, in our clinic, in Cannabis Australia, we do not say to patients that medical cannabis is going to cure your cancer. Okay, there are patients who are trying to manage their cancer with it, and indeed there's many studies on the right dosing, which we can feed back to the patient, but we must not sell them false information or false hope. These patients are very desperate. They feel very hopeless and in some circumstances very let down by the medical profession.
I agree with that comment. We really, have to manage patients' expectations, because sometimes we are quite overinflated, especially in this patient group. So we are able to manage their symptoms and help them out. But I guess, reducing the shrinking tumors and so on would be a bit unrealistic. Plus, look, I love medicine. I love cannabis. It's a great plant, beautiful medicine, but it's not like a miracle drug or panacea for everyone. It just needs to be used responsibly and judiciously in a proper clinical setting.
Yeah, all very, very valid points. Sorry, go ahead, Gull.
Yeah, in terms of considering it, I mean, in order for us to be able to prescribe medical cannabis, we have to get approval from the TGA, or if we've got authorized prescriber status, we have to satisfy ourselves that the person qualifies. And essentially that's, have they got a problem that's bad enough that they've tried, let's say, everything else that's available. And if it's therapeutic, then it's got to be therapeutically, it's approved by the TGA. If they've tried those things or they're not willing to try them for good enough reasons, and there's inverted commas around that good enough, then there's a very good reason for us to consider medical cannabis. And that's for us, we go to the TGA and say, here's a patient who's got this problem, they've tried this for it, and they've still got symptoms. That's why we want to try the medical cannabis. And I think those three, they're relatively simple criteria. And that, especially in the palliative care setting, I mean, there's no question that already we're trying everything, and we're constantly, it's a constant delicate balance between keeping people comfortable and not giving them too much of something that makes them uncomfortable. So even though we've used the TGA approved products previously, whether they're opioids or antiemetics or whatever they are, it's not a very big step to use something else again. And I think we can have a very low threshold for adding the concept of medical cannabis in to a palliative care setting.
Yep. And this sort of, leads me to my next question. Is it, should physicians wait for the patient to raise the issue of using cannabis for palliative care, or is it okay for clinicians to raise this issue given that it's not yet been approved by regulatory bodies?
I think it's okay both ways. If we see that very appropriate patient, is on so many medication and so on, we can suggest that, obviously without pushing that they have to go through it, but to provide the information if we are comfortable and we know and we've got some experience and knowledge, I think it's practically okay that clinician may initiate it. In my experience, I actually never initiated cannabis script. All the patients approached me. And I think this is probably the experience of other cannabis clinicians as well. But I think both ways is perfectly okay. It's a very important medicine, and both ways is fine.
I certainly, yeah, I'd agree with what's been said, and I think that it's one of those things where it shouldn't actually be brought up in the sense of trying to push something and actually saying, well, let's go down this route, because that sort of paternalistic medicine can be quite tricky to avoid. But just like anything else, having patients to discuss the options that are available in terms of palliative chemo, palliative surgery, those sorts of things. It's just making patients aware of what's available and actually going through the risks and benefits of every treatment modality, just like you normally would with anything else.
Yeah, it's just
I think.
Okay.
Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead. Okay, Gull, go ahead.
I think that it's increasingly, for those of us that have seen patients improve so well in a number of different ways with medical cannabis, it's more and more difficult for us not to raise it, because it's our role to help our patients. And if we know about something that might help them and we don't talk about it, I think there's a serious issue with that. I mean, I agree with Joel to say, it's not something we should push, but similarly, it's not our role to tell people what to do. It is our role to tell them what the options are as we see it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Patients should be aware of what's available, and cannabis is becoming less and less stigma drug. It's not pot anymore. It's a proper therapeutic agent that should be used in a proper clinical setting. Because I think there's still a bit of stigma sometimes. We are almost slightly embarrassed about it, but we shouldn't be. It's a great plant.
The phrase that comes to mind hearing the fellow panelists here is duty of care. Our duty of care is to provide patients with all the relevant information so they can make informed decisions on their healthcare. And further to that is not to just say the aspects of medicine or traditional therapies which may provide potential benefit. For example, say opioids for your metastatic cancer pain. And if you're going to do that, the duty of care would be to also inform them of the potential risks and side effects of this. Medical cannabis is not without harm. As I said before, we do not use it to treat cancers, although there's early research into that. And it's not without harm. There's potential side effects. But as I say to patients, I often start with a mantra, which is, it won't cure your cancer, it won't put hair on your head, and there is some potential harm for it. But recently, in the last 2 weeks, I've had patients who have had their cancer cured, who have grown hair on their head, which is completely fascinating, but anecdotal. Our duty of care is to inform them of what the potential effects of both traditional therapies are and alternative therapies, although I don't like that word, I prefer plant-based medicines. Those side effects, if we prescribe opioids, and I prescribed opioids in hospital for over 10 years there, we're talking about 1,200 patients in Australia dying every year. Okay, if we were going to prescribe them anticonvulsants, your gabapentin, your Lyrica, that's 120 people a year. Antidepressants, about 80. Benzodiazepines, even more than that. So likewise, if we're saying that we should be nice and clear, and I'm sure our fellow doctors explain the potential side effects and benefits of medical cannabis, our duty of care must extend beyond that to traditional therapies and letting patients be sure that they're aware of these potential dangerous and addictive properties of some of these medications.
Yeah, I'd like to also comment that legally prescribed drugs also, in spite of being rigorously researched and investigated through proper clinical trials, they still come with a long list of adverse effects including death when overdose. So their safety is not guaranteed. And as far as we know, there's not really reported deaths due to cannabis overdose. I mean, cases can be circumstantial, but cannabis has much safer profile than anything else. And that makes me feel confident in choosing that plant as well.
Yeah, all really valid points. In regards to prescribing cannabis, is there strong evidence for cannabis's efficacy for treating cancer symptoms or other terminal illness symptoms? I mean, obviously, when you put your application in to the TGA, you have to back it up with evidence to get that approval for the patient. What kind of evidence are you seeing from the past, but also coming out now to support those applications and support you in your decision to choose cannabis as a viable treatment option for your patients?
For most commonly prescribed conditions, TGA is not really requesting TGA is not really requesting the evidence anymore. And TGA guidelines state that there is low level of evidence for prescribing cannabis in palliative care. However, you know, I think it's very important to look at other evidence coming from prescribing clinicians or patients, you know, observational evidence and so on. But this is very, very important considerations. So in spite of, you know, the official guidelines, I think there's significant evidence for cannabis in palliative care. It just depends on where we look.
Yeah, so certainly in 2017, the effects, the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids released from the National Academies of Science, Engineering and Medicine. Yes, it was in the US, but that was really, really powerful because it did show that there was substantial evidence for not only chronic pain, but certainly also acute chemo-induced nausea and vomiting. So that was really, really powerful to actually have this comprehensive review that really showed a lot of doctors, oh, okay, hang on, this is a viable option with evidence behind it.
That's right.
I think as well, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. One of the problems with the evidence to date with medical cannabis is it's been treated as a single entity. And that's just, it's actually farcical if you really think about it. It's like saying, do pharmacies work? So you have to be able to distinguish between different chemovars, or at least different, in our case in Australia, we've got products. Each product's got its own array of cannabinoids and terpenes, and depending on how it's formulated and how it's used, it will have a different effect. So we need to be building evidence. I mean, we've got lots of personal clinical evidence and huge anecdotal evidence, and we're building the evidence in Australia, but realistically, we need to be able to say, does this product work for this symptom? Because we can't just talk about medical cannabis as a single entity. It doesn't, it just defies logic.
That's why I believe that when it comes to cannabis, it's not going to be necessary that this product is for pain, this product for that symptom, that product is for mental health. To me, cannabis is a multi-target drug. It works on many levels. And quite often patients come to us for pain, but then they say, oh, my skin is better, my digestion has improved, my mood is better as well. So I think that when it comes to, it's not necessarily about products for this condition or for that symptom. I think it's more to do with balancing the tone of the endocannabinoid system and balancing the deficiency in the endocannabinoid system. And that's why I think we're observing responses on many levels because we are balancing this. So that's why people start sleeping better, digestion is improving and other things. So perhaps we need to change the way of thinking, not necessarily product for symptom, but what is the endocannabinoid deficiency for each individual patient. But just my personal opinion, could be right or wrong, but I think it is.
I agree with you, Teresa. I think though that type of thinking is so far removed from the current medical black and white model. You're talking about wellness, and we don't really do wellness that very well in our system. I agree with you completely. But in order to get there,
as well.
no.
You know,
But I think one step at a time. If we sneak a product in for pain and it helps with nausea, sleep, and anxiety, we go, oh, look at that. What interesting. We actually have positive side effects.
You know, when it comes to research, humans are so annoying for not being rats or mice. We are unfortunately unpredictable, and we need to look at evidence in many ways.
Yeah, and following on from the chat about evidence, there's evidence for efficacy on one side and evidence for safety. I think we've got enough data. We don't need any more studies on the safety. The TGA knows the safety profile. I recently requested a freedom of information request like any of the fellow audience can. You can go to the TGA website and see the adverse events notification. You can find every single notification in the whole of Australia since 1970s. Okay, we know it is safe. What we really have to get is more research on the efficacy. The TGA has on their own website a list of studies in palliative care. I think they list 13 of them, most of them grade 1, grade 2, so quantify the studies based on their quality or perceived quality, and most of those would be, at the top would be double-blind randomized control trials, these gold standard trials. Very hard to get palliative care patients into these trials when patients are saying, but I know it works, so it worked for my mother who had cancer, the same breast cancer, it worked for my friend. They're not going to sit around going, I want to be on this trial to see if it's safe or if it's going to benefit me. They want an N of 1 trial. They want to get started straight away and see if it works. And we manage that by saying, here's the safety profile. Important considerations, I think, for a transparent consultations, you need to mention what the price is. Just like we don't want to sell false dreams of that it's going to cure everybody's cancer or it's going to solve all their problems of wellness. We must be transparent about what the cost is, and that's a big hurdle for a lot of patients as they're trying to rearrange their finances for, potentially sorting out their family or all of those necessities. They need to know what the cost is, what the safety profile is, and what the potential benefits are. And I think there's enough information on the safety side. The efficacy will have to come down to a lot of working with the patient to find their minimal effective dose.
Sure, and we've just actually had a question come in on the chat, actually asking about whether or not there have been any studies done or in progress that combine clinical efficacy with cost effectiveness of the medicine.
Good question. I'm not aware of any of the cost of medicines. One of the challenges that we have in Australia right now is the medicines or products, as Gull referred to, are quite expensive, predominantly imported from overseas markets, the EU or Canada. When you factor in the licensing for importation, you're looking at comparative pricings to Canada, but in terms of the price points, at around about 11 to 12 cents per milligram of CBD and about 16 cents per milligram of THC, and then THC flower anywhere from $12 a gram to about $20 a gram roughly. So for those prices, I think that the comparative to international markets and what we have is a commodity pricing where these products can be shipped from one country to another. So a lot of producers or LPs or growers are looking to recoup their capital investment by sending it overseas. I don't think there's a lot of studies in Australia for the use of palliative care patients and whether it's cost effective compared to it, but I would hazard a guess you don't need to study. It's cheaper to use drugs that will kill you. Opioids are cheaper. They'll cost on a PBS a couple of dollars. The government will give you the script for them and you can go off to the pharmacy and get them really cheap, and then the medication that's unlikely to kill you and potentially help with some of your symptoms is going to cost you a lot more than that. And for palliative patients, probably in the vicinity of $15 a day is from my own patients. And I myself only have 600 patients, but our clinic has, I did a check this morning, approximately 4,000 active patients, or patients who've consulted within the last few months. From the majority of patients who are non-palliative, it's approximately $4 to $10 a day. But the palliative patients are a bit more, and that's really got to do with slightly more THC from our clinic.
Yeah, and I know we're going to have a panel later this afternoon looking at different products and dosages and formulations. But you've sort of raised a really valid point in regards to the different cannabis medicines that are available in Australia, and obviously we don't have quite the diversity that some of the other countries, such as Canada, already have available. But we're quite aware of some of the effects of THC and CBD being sort of the more popular cannabinoids. But with respect to the other cannabinoids and terpenes from an entourage perspective, is there any data, or have you had any experience yourselves that help guide which TGA registered medicines or unregistered cannabis medicines are more or less beneficial for specific symptoms? I know we've talked a lot about pain as well as sleep and general wellness. I'm not sure if Gull, if you would like to lead that question.
That's a great question, and it sits with me all the time. In fact, I'm in the process of building, both in my mind and using an online database to basically work out all the TGA approved products we have in Australia and the full profile that we have, like THC, CBD, all the cannabinoids, all the terpenes, ideally to let's say 0.1 of a milligram. The information that we can get from the companies, if that can be updated all the time. The reason I'm kind of answering your question with a no, we don't have that information at the moment. I certainly don't. I think we're building it slowly clinically, but threading in some of the previous comments, especially what Teresa was saying, if I have a patient that's got pain, nausea, anxiety, and insomnia, and I kind of plug those things in to the database, and it says, well, this particular product has the appropriate cannabinoid and terpene profile for those particular symptoms, I'm more likely to get a targeted, nuanced approach. It's like if you used leafly, if you were using, let's call it recreational cannabis, and you wanted to use, we had a dispensary down the road and you could use a particular strain to get the effect you wanted, you could do that yourself. Clinically, we don't have that level of granularity in the products that we have and that we have available. I mean, the data's kind of there, but it's a little bit out of reach. And I think if we can bring that all together, we would have a much more targeted approach to using cannabis. The caveat's always going to be different people respond differently because of their own endocannabinoid system and how they can actually ingest or inhale or however they're using the product. But I think in terms of which product to use when, based on the cannabinoid and terpene profile, I think that would be a wonderful, I think it would be a quantitative step forward in cannabis use in Australia.
Hey, Gull, I've got some great news. There is our organisation's worked quite hard to come up with a platform called canview.com.au, which will enable doctors, patients and pharmacists all to register on the platform, and they will be able to look at the products if they've been prescribed it. If they're a patient, if they're a pharmacist, they'll be able to order all in one spot, all the products that are available. They'll be able to request all the certificates of analysis and profile and the chemovars that you alluded to. And also be able to see the price for that. Right now, it's such a disparate system where if you're a pharmacist or a doctor, you're going to have to get all that information individually. This company will send it to you. This company's got this stock level. This company's got COAs. This company, you can't even ask what the COAs, who knows where they are. And you're getting this all from disparate entities. So the view of CanView was really to put it all in one place. So clinicians and patients and pharmacists can be able to approach it methodically. I wouldn't say it'd be the Leafly of Australia. That's a long way to go, but it's certainly trying to put all that information in one place.
Yeah, great. And I'd be more than happy to have some chats offline, Gull, in how the AIMC could assist with that. And I think it's one of the things that, as the Australian industry does, grow a little bit more, and we are seeing, the costs of products coming down, but we're also seeing more diversity so that you can actually, prescribe a patient and be a little bit more specific, as opposed to a lot of these medicines that are currently available. They don't actually have a minor cannabinoid profile or a terpene profile or things like that. So it definitely, as the market matures in Australia, we're going to have a lot more diversity in products to be able to prescribe to our patients. Now, I know we've only got a minute left in this session. So I know I've got a couple of questions that we'll probably try and answer in the chat, but I did just want to actually mention a comment in the chat that has come from a patient who you know, was just saying how fantastic it was once they finally were able to access medical cannabis, that they initially were able to drop some of the pharmaceuticals that they were already taking, and then have now actually stopped all regular pharmaceutical use and have been able to replace that with their cannabis medicines, which I think is, you know, is really fantastic, especially when we think of some of the issues with opioids that we have around the world. But being able to replace, you know, a full suite of a medicine cabinet with one plant is really incredible. So I would like to thank you all for your time today, and we look forward to watching your careers in the medical cannabis space. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily.